Ellen DeGeneres was out yucking it up with former President George W. Bush at a baseball game, and this rightfully stirred up a bit of controversy. Now, I'm going to get into why Ellen's friendship with George W. Bush is controversial. But before I do that, there's another interesting part of the story, which is some of the defenses that people are trying to make of Ellen being buddy-buddy with a war criminal. On Twitter I've seen people sharing the video of Ellen defending her friendship with George W. Bush on her show and putting the caption, "If you're mad at Ellen, you're part of the problem." Basically insinuating that the main problem in politics is how toxic it is and the divisiveness and people being ideologically intolerant, so much so that if you're even caught with a person who aligns with the opposition party, you'll be chastised and lambasted for it. But anyone who's making that argument, you're missing the point. No one's saying you can't socialize or have a cordial conversation with someone who's a Republican or votes Republican. The main problem here is George W. Bush is a mass murderer and a war criminal, among many other things. So it's bizarre that Ellen, a grown-ass adult human being who was alive during the Bush administration, will go out and befriend a man who, like I said, is a torturer, a war criminal, a mass murderer, arguably responsible for at least 1 million deaths in Iraq alone. There's an argument to be made that George W. Bush has more blood on his hands than any other living being on this planet. So it's bizarre for you to go out and say, I'm going to make that man my friend. And yes, I get it. George W. Bush is a human being. He has a family. He has people that he grew up with and have known him for his entire life, and they have their own subjective, emotionally biased opinions of George W. Bush, and they'll say nice things about him. I don't expect his mom to come out and rip him for being a war criminal and say he should be locked up in The Hague. I'm sure his kids say nice things about him, his siblings, his wife, his childhood friends. But Ellen, you don't have those ties to that man. You don't know this man. You didn't know him up until recently. You made the conscious decision after knowing what we know about George W. Bush and the kind of man that he is and what he did as president and the millions and millions of lives he's ruined, the war crimes he's done, the mass murders that he's signed off on, the torture. You know all of this stuff, and you're still going to say, yeah, it's not really a big deal to me. I don't think that's much of a big deal to me. I'd still like to hang out with him on the weekends. Like, the reason why people are mad, one of the reasons why I'm mad at this is because, or at least at the very least confused, is why aren't all those things that I just listed enough for you to make a character judgment of George W. Bush by his actions, by his record, by his legacy, by the policies that he pushed for and enacted that ruined millions of lives? Why can't you just look at that and say, as a reasonable, objective person, I can see that George W. Bush is a terrible person who is immoral, has absolutely no ethics or moral compass, and is willing to lie an entire country into a war just so that him and his rich buddies can profit off of it. From right there, you should just be able to say, yeah, I'm good. I don't really want to be friends with anyone like that because you're just a shitty, terrible human being. But that's not the case with Ellen for some reason. If it was me or you or anybody you know in your own personal life, being friends with George W. Bush isn't even an option. It's not even a possibility. There's no overlap there. From what we know about this man, he's ruined our lives with his shitty, terrible policies, domestic policies, and he's ruined the lives of millions of other people, killed millions of other people around the world with his shitty foreign policy. And that's all we know about this man. His legacy is terrible and he's ruined millions of lives. That's it. There's no overlap. But with Ellen, there is that overlap because they're part of that elite top 1% class, the oligarch class in America, where they're financially stable. They don't have to worry about healthcare. It's not their loved ones out there dying in a war. They don't have to worry about housing. They don't have to worry about how they're going to keep their lights on. So the policy takes a back seat, and they can actually get to know George W. Bush on a personal level. And because they go to the same parties and they hang out at the same golf clubs and they go to baseball games and see each other, and they see each other at official functions and on the red carpet and things like that. So they have all these things in common. Hey, George, where do you want a vacation this year? Did you stay at that one resort in Greece last year? Oh my God, I stayed and it was amazing. They have all these things to converse and come together on. And then there's this extra layer of, the shitty policies that he doesn't affect me or anybody I know or I like personally. So can't really be too mad about that. That also factors into it too. And here's another point to prove that she just really doesn't care about his terrible policy legacy and the effect that he had on millions of people on this planet. If she actually was someone with principles and cared about other people and actually gave a shit about the million dead Iraqis or the millions and millions of refugees who had to flee their home because of the Iraq war and all these other wars that we started, if she cared at all about the shitty, horrific domestic policies that the George W. Bush administration enacted, how they exacerbated the healthcare crisis. It was under the George W. Bush administration when people were being denied health coverage because of pre-existing conditions. And all the other George W. Bush administration was the pre-Obamacare healthcare system, the wild, wild west of profit rule everything. The insurance companies, they'll take 50 or 60% of the money you give them to pay for your healthcare costs, and they'll use that to pay their executives and to pay their CEOs and give them their shareholders all these boosted prices so they can do stock buybacks and stuff like that. So the most barbaric the healthcare system ever was under George W. Bush administration. If Ellen cared about any of these issues at all, I don't see how you can be friends with this man and sit with him for hours at a time and not bring up any of these issues. Not bring up, hey man, this Iraq war is fucking crazy. You started this shit. You lied us into this war. 18 years later, we're still in that war. Millions of dead Iraqi civilians, thousands of dead U.S. troops. We spent trillions of dollars on this war, trillions of dollars that could have been spent here in the United States on infrastructure or to pay for healthcare or to pay for education. You ran this country into a ditch, George. Do you have any answers for that? Damn well she never asked that question. You know damn well she never asked about what was the real motivation for going into Iraq, because it clearly had nothing to do with 9/11. All evidence points to it being just rank corruption, and George W. Bush and Dick Cheney and all the other defense contractors and the oil industry just wanted to run out the back door with all the money. That's what it looked like the motivation for going into Iraq was. If you or any other person was in a room with George W. Bush, I'm sure those and many other policy questions would be at the top of mind and would be the first thing you'd ask him. But again, Ellen does not care because she is part of the elite. She's part of the 1%. She's asking George Bush where's he going to go on vacation because she's curious, because she might want to go on vacation there too. She's not asking about policy. She's not asking about the million dead Iraqis. She doesn't care. She does not care. Because I can guarantee you this, if she was asking George W. Bush those tough questions, he would not be so quick to be doing fun little baseball game dates with Ellen, because he'd be like, oh yeah, she's kind of grilling me on all these policy decisions I made, these insanely corrupt, indefensible policy decisions. If she was asking those tough questions to George W. Bush, they would not be friends. The part that honestly probably made me more mad than anything else, which is what Ellen is doing and what the media likes to do is whitewash our war criminals. We like to pretend, yeah, they might have done some heinous shit around the world. They might be responsible for genocides and assassinating world leaders and starting wars for profit and war profiteering and indiscriminately murdering civilians and blocking food from getting into countries and destroying the infrastructure. Yeah, our war criminals may do all of those things, but they did it for the best reasons, and we can't ever hold it against them. So we'll whitewash all the shit that they did. We won't mention the mass murders and the torture and the illegal mass surveillance. We're not going to mention all the terrible and most relevant parts of their legacy. Instead, we will ask them about what their favorite TV show is and what was the last movie they saw, and ask them for silly, funny, personal moments that they shared with their loved ones in their lives. We'll ask them all these things to make them seem like a regular old loving person, and we will put that image of them out there for the country to see, but we won't really talk about the important shit that exposes U.S. empire and the imperialism and the failures of these regime change wars, and just how morally bankrupt U.S. foreign policy is. And the media does this all the time. They did it with George W. Bush. They do it with even Barack Obama, because Barack Obama is just as much a war criminal as George W. Bush. They do it with Dick Cheney, have him come out and every time he's trying to hawk a new book on why we should torture and why we should illegally invade a new country to do regime change war, they'll trot his ass up out on mainstream media and talk to him like he's some world-renowned expert in the field of national security. They do it with Joe Biden. Joe Biden's a war criminal too. Every fucking war that has gone on since Joe Biden has been in politics, Joe Biden has co-signed and he has pushed for. But you won't ever hear that side of Joe Biden in the media. You won't ever hear that. Instead, they'll talk about his personal family tragedies and how he's such a strong, persistent, determined person and middle-class Joe and all of that shit. That's what you'd hear about him in the media. You won't hear about all the blood that he has on his hands. Even Mohammed bin Salman. Ellen DeGeneres herself had Mohammed bin Salman, who is, with the help of the U.S. government, conducting a genocide in Yemen, the worst humanitarian crisis on the planet. While that was happening, Ellen DeGeneres had him on her show and was just yucking it up with him. She ain't ask him about the millions of people starving to death in Yemen. She didn't ask him about the illegal blockade where we're not allowing food or medicine into the country. She didn't ask Mohammed bin Salman about the fact that the coalition that he's leading has bombed over 50% of the hospitals in Yemen and they're not operational. She didn't ask him about all that. She didn't ask him about that one time when their airstrike hit a fucking school bus and killed 40 children. She didn't ask him about that. Instead, she did what I'm just explaining right now. She whitewashed Mohammed bin Salman so that her viewers, the millions and millions of viewers that she has across the country, the only image that they have of Mohammed bin Salman is the goofy, funny, lovable character that she tried to portray when she was with him on her show. So that's the real root reason why people should be upset at what Ellen is doing with George W. Bush, because she went out there on her show and said, yes, George W. Bush is my friend and let me defend my friendship with this fucking mass murderer and war criminal. When you're doing that, you're minimizing the real harm that he's caused and destruction that he's responsible for on this planet here in the United States and across the Middle East. So that's where a lot of the backlash came from. This culture of just praising war criminals and acting as if the blood that they have on their hands doesn't count. You can't make a character judgment off of the mass murdering that they did. Another problem I have with Ellen being friends with George W. Bush is this is flaunting the fact that we have a separate justice system in the United States when it comes to our elites and the people in the establishment and our war criminals. No matter how egregious the crime, for whatever reason in the United States, we refuse to prosecute our war criminals within our government. And Barack Obama made sure that that's the case. Barack Obama came in after 8 years of Bush and Cheney and the illegal war in Iraq and the illegal unconstitutional drone assassination program, the torture, the international kidnapping and torture network that we had where we were kidnapping people from countries all around the world and bringing them to CIA black sites and torturing them. All of that stuff those are all illegal. Those are all war crimes. And had it been some African warlord who have done those very same crimes, they'd be sitting in a prison for the rest of their life after being prosecuted for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Bush's administration fabricated evidence to start an illegal war where we killed 1 million innocent Iraqi civilians, set the Middle East on fire, gave rise to jihadist groups like ISIS, and created a humanitarian crisis when you take into account the starvation and the immigration crisis on a scale that the world has not seen since World War II. George W. Bush is responsible for that. And here in the United States, we have the power and authority to prosecute George W. Bush and the people in his administration, like Dick Cheney and Paul Wolfowitz and Donald Rumsfeld and John Bolton, who committed these war crimes, covered them up, and did it all for corrupt reasons. But when the Obama administration came in, they said, we're looking forward, not backwards, and we will not be prosecuting or investigating any of the crimes of the Bush administration. And because of that, we have yet another generation of U.S. war criminals allowed to roam free and socialize in polite society. And when we see George W. Bush and people in his administration, like John Bolton and Dick Cheney, just walking around freely, not behind bars, not fearing prosecution, that alone already offends my sensibilities. But to see them just cashing in and living it up. John Bolton, he's done nothing but get promotions. He was the national security advisor to the president of the United States for over a year now. He got a promotion for his war crimes and all his warmongering. George W. Bush, he's out painting and selling his paintings of the veterans that he sent to war for bullshit reasons to begin with. But he's out there living it up with his wife and, he's spending time with his family and all that. Dick Cheney and Dick Cheney's every other year, he comes out with a book explaining why we should torture, which is illegal, by the way, explaining the justifications to why the United States should use torture and giving a list of countries that he thinks the United States should invade. And Dick Cheney gets to do that freely, and he gets all the airtime he wants on mainstream media. And then, so when Ellen is sitting at a baseball game with George W. Bush, all it does is remind people of that separate justice system that we have for the elites and members of the establishment and our war criminals. And then Tulsi Gabbard comes in and throws herself into the mix. For what reason, I have no idea, but she's on the wrong side of this. She's out here defending Ellen, basically saying, yeah, we all need to stop being so divisive and so toxic, and we need to be able to get along and aloha and all that shit. Now, Tulsi is rightfully getting a lot of heat for that because her whole campaign is running against these regime change wars and these disastrous wars that George W. Bush started when he was president. Her origin story really starts from when she went off to serve in the Iraq War after the lies that the Bush administration and the media told the country. And when she was there, she realized, we're not out here defending freedom and democracy. This was a war for profit and to boost the profits of the defense contractors and the oil companies. We're not here to liberate the people of Iraq. All of that shit is a lie. She came to that realization when she was out there in Iraq. So Ellen DeGeneres comes out and defends the man who lied your ass into going into a war that you say traumatized you. If you ever heard if you've ever heard Tulsi Gabbard tell the story about why she has that white streak in her hair, it's not because she dyed it to be edgy or anything like that. She says that happened from after she deployed to Iraq and the stress of having to see and deal with all the injuries and the casualties from the war. So the man who's responsible for doing that to you, traumatizing you, lying your ass into a war, making you watch the people that you served with in the Middle East die for no goddamn reason. When Ellen DeGeneres comes out and says, that's my friend, I'm going to defend him and nobody's going to tell me anything about it, why on earth are you going to come out and say, yeah, Ellen's right, we should all be friends with George W. Bush? That makes no sense. And just from a political strategy point, that it makes even less sense. Because, okay, Ellen's out here defending being friends with George W. Bush. It stirs up this whole controversy and a whole national discussion about why she shouldn't be friends with George W. Bush. And that conversation is largely focused on his terrible, disgusting, corrupt record of mass murder and torture and illegal wars in the Middle East. If your whole campaign is centered on adopting a leftist, non-interventionist, anti-imperialist foreign policy, why wouldn't you take this and use this as an opportunity to remind the American people, who we all know have a short attention span, remind them of what actually happened and how we got into Iraq and Afghanistan and all these other wars that we're still in to this day? You remind the American people how 1 million Iraqi civilians end up dead and thousands of U.S. troops ended up dead and injured. You could have taken this opportunity to remind the voters in the Democratic primary that why we should be more outraged and livid over our foreign policy, and why voting for a candidate who's going to get us out of these wars should be a top priority for all voters. She could have used this as an opportunity to do that and to make her case, but she didn't. Instead, she wanted to go with this goofy ass bipartisan kumbaya, let's hold hands and sing it out bullshit that she keeps trying to do. And this isn't the first time she put herself in a weird position where she's trying to defend civility and decorum, even though in that particular situation it doesn't make much sense. One of the more recent examples I can think of was the whole Joe Biden thing. When Joe Biden was being blasted and being called a racist, even if you don't want to call Joe Biden a racist, common sense would have just told you, you know what, let me just stay out of this, because I might not be willing to call Joe Biden a racist, but there's definitely merit if somebody did want to call Joe Biden a racist. You won't have to look much further than the crime bill and him working with segregationists to lock up black and brown people across this country. Or you look at his position on desegregation. He was siding with the segregationists against busing black kids into white schools. You look at his position on, you look at the bankruptcy bill that he wrote, screws over poor people in favor of the rich, and who's more likely to be poor? Minority people. So there's an argument to be made that through his policies alone and how they have ravished and devastated the black community, that yes, you can say Joe Biden's a racist because he has arguably done more harm to black people than almost anyone in this country through his policies. So even if Tulsi Gabbard was to say, you know what, I might not want to call Joe Biden a racist, but I'm just going to stick out of this one because that's not really a winning position to try to argue that Joe Biden definitely 100% is not a racist, because there's a case to be made there. Instead, no, she does not take that position. She goes on the offense and she goes after Kamala Harris for, yes, she was politicizing it and she was trying to capitalize on the media and everybody ripping Joe Biden for his questionable history on race. But Kamala Harris, even though she was being politically craven and she probably doesn't care about it as much, and she on busing, she had the same position, she is kind of technically right. So just stay out of it. You could just stay out of it. And that's my point that I'm trying to make here. This is just an unforced error. You put yourself in the middle of this for no reason. And you're forcing the people who usually side with you and defend you when you're being attacked and smeared in the media and by your other political opponents. You're making those people come out and criticize you for a position that you just did not have to take. So that's the point I'm trying to make. It was just bad strategy all around for Tulsi Gabbard to defend Ellen on this. And it was a real missed opportunity because she could have really blasted the Bush administration and their terrible foreign policy record and made the case as to why she should be a serious candidate that the voters are looking at, because her foreign policy is the exact opposite of George Bush's foreign policy. And if you're mad about George Bush's foreign policy, you should be supporting a non-interventionist, anti-imperialist like Tulsi Gabbard. She could have made that case, but she didn't. So This is an annoying story all around. Ellen, I mean, it's just clear she's rich and she's out of touch, and that seems to be the main problem here.